Hello, and thank you for joining us. The following video is an extract from one of a series of academic Wednesday worldwide webinars hosted by the Institute of Economic Affairs in cooperation with the Vincent Centre, University of Buckingham. In this video, we hear from Dr. Simon Kaye of the NLGN think tank, who discusses Elinor Ostrom and community power in the UK.
Thanks very much, Slade. And I'm just going to try and share my screen quickly because I have a few slides just as a visual aid. And I'll switch that to... Can you see everyone? Can everyone see that? Is that okay?
That works, yeah.
There we go. Okay, first of all, just thanks to you, Syed, and to the IEA too. I think the first thing to mention is that Ostrom's work has a really wide intellectual, interdisciplinary, and a broad political appeal as well. And that's why she's talked about as much by deep green environmentalists as she is by Austrian free marketeers. The point being that there's enormous scope for an unpolarized consensus around some of the arguments and policy points that Ostrom made over the years, over her incredible career. And that's why she has, in our opinion at NLGN, in my opinion, such potential to transform this very centralized country, the UK, that we're living in for the better. I just want to start by telling you about a few things that are going on around the UK right now. These are projects that tend to fly under the collective radar. They're beneath public consciousness a lot of the time. They don't really get picked up on that often by people engaging in the national policy debate. But they illustrate some very important things. In particular, the capacity for communities to self-organize, to manage their own resources, their own local assets, and to solve problems in a collaborative way. So let me just transition the slide. So the picture on the left there is from Barrowcliff, which is an area, a locality in the town of Scarborough, in the north of England. This is a picture of a green space. The community planned and commissioned this new green space in a part of Scarborough that has experienced historically low levels of investment. It's relatively deprived compared to even other parts of Scarborough, relatively high levels of crime as well. The community commissioned it, planned it, it disposed funds towards it. It now collaborates in maintaining it. It found beyond that green space consensus around investment in local services to help families to address community needs as their community saw and defined them. It's setting up support for local businesses and investing long term. Now, all of this was made possible by a big charitable donation, essentially. There's a scheme that some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with called Big Local. And it's a lottery funded program run by the local trust, where £1 million are given, a pot of money is given to specific neighborhoods, and this is happening all over the country, Scarborough, Barrowcliff, just one example. And then the community gets to invest on the things that they choose to spend their money on. And these projects, and in particular, the big success stories like the one playing out in Barrowcliff, are kind of proof of concept of the idea, active right now in the UK, that communities can manage their own resources. The second picture, the picture in the middle, is of Bromley Baths in Leeds. And that's a historic local swimming pool, essentially, a facility that was taken over by the residents of the immediate neighborhood around it when it was threatened with closure by the council that was running it at the time. And that community built investment, built the service offering of that facility, crowdfunded for more support. The baths are now financially self-sufficient, which is a huge contrast from when they were running at a loss and being controlled by the local council. It's also a local asset in other ways. It's providing services. They're teaching kids to swim. They're giving skills-building jobs, employing dozens of young people in the local area. It's just one of thousands of community businesses in the UK. Many of them are supported by Power to Change, who's a partner on the project I'm talking about today, where locally important businesses and assets are taken on from councils by communities and then proceed to be governed in a way that maximizes their potential. This third picture, the picture on the right of your screen, is a picture from a village called Brockham in Surrey. And in 2013, the local community realized the council wouldn't have the resources to respond to the massive threat of the floods that were hitting that village and many other areas around the UK that winter, 2013-14. So this is a community that took matters into its own hands. It identified the pressure points in the local watercourses and moved to maintain them. It's still maintaining them today. They gave relief to local residents. They redirected traffic. They set up new flood defenses. And after the crisis, this community response kept going. They became a hub for local life. They provided a diversity of services. They're still providing them today. These days, they're involving their local young people in regular activities. They're giving people things to do that contribute to the local civil society. They're even sending some of those young people on to university to study disaster management. And the fourth example I don't have a picture for because it's a situation that's so current, it's playing out right now, and it's the subject of some current research we're doing separate to the Ostrom project at NLGN. Right now, there are millions of shielding, self-isolating people in this country, and those people are receiving critical supplies, services, not from the state, not from any tier of government, but from spontaneous community groups. We're researching those groups right now. And the example I'd like to draw your attention to just off the bat is in Howden in Yorkshire, where one of these mutual aid groups, and this is just one example, it's by no means a special example, is delivering food and medicine. This group is planning and running a new food bank. It's organized a weekly book and jigsaw exchange. It's organized helplines for locals. It's got a dedicated team of volunteers who make regular phone contact with people during the crisis who are living on their own to combat loneliness. And they've even set up some pretty sophisticated data protection and safeguarding processes as well to keep the council happy. All of this is playing out autonomously. All of it is happening voluntarily. And these mutual aid groups are effectively making the social distancing and isolation policies of the national government workable. They're helping isolating vulnerable people to survive the experience of this pandemic. So those are just 4 examples I wanted to draw your attention to right off the bat. There are lots more. I could have picked any other 4 examples, but there are some things I'd like to note about them just to get going. First, from a traditional political economy perspective, a lot of these community behaviors would be viewed at least as outliers and away from the norm of the kinds of behaviors we might expect given incentive structures and rationality of individual action. Where, one might ask, do the incentives come from for this scale and depth of cooperation? Why, a centralist or a statist might ask, isn't the state the default provider of all the services I've just described? Why didn't they handle the delivery of those services better? Second thing I want to point to is that, and this is related to what I just said, in the UK context, each of these community endeavours has had to swim against the institutional tide. They've had enormous resistance. It's been an uphill struggle to set up their systems, to organise themselves, to get moving in the first place. The state is simply assumed in this country to be the monopoly service provider under all circumstances. For these different approaches to prosper, everything depends on the posture of the state. The state needs to actively move to facilitate, or at least to make room for community action of this sort. So these projects, which at NLGN and in many other organizations are referred to sometimes as part of a community power movement, they show the capability, the capacity of UK communities, neighborhoods, to cooperate deeply, to come up with their own systems and approaches, to behave autonomously, to manage resources effectively. And of course, yes, they've all been uphill battles. The fact that a lot of these projects have come into existence at the time that they have, and given the institutional context that we're living in, is more evidence for the viability of this approach. The research I've been doing at NLGN makes clear that in almost every community, self-governance success stories in the UK are based on the state's stance. That relationship with the local council or even with the central government has an absolutely pivotal role to play. The state has a make or break power in the success of community-centered activity. Now this, I think, leads us pretty naturally to the work of Elinor Ostrom. And Ostrom was identified in the 2019 NLGN community paradigm work, which was a sort of an agenda-setting piece of work for what we're doing now on devolution of power, localism, putting communities in control. That paper identified Elinor Ostrom as an intellectual inspiration, and the project I've been working on is fleshing that inspiration out, using it to win some policy arguments. So the question I suppose I really want to ask, given the context we're in, and given the plausibility of community action as a basis for services and for the building up of civil society and of well-being, is why is there such a huge Ostrom-shaped hole in the UK's policy debate? The UK 2070 Commission, the IPPR, and the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, and the UK Treasury have all described the UK as one of the most centralised countries in the world in the last 5 years. We're living in an incredibly centralised economy and political system, even after a devolution programme that was run primarily from behind the doors of New Labour and the coalition government over the last 20 to 30 years. We're also living in a country that's shaped by a huge discourse around regional inequality, left behind places, the desire expressed by some to take back control, which of course had a huge impact on our political future just a few years ago. So why doesn't policymaking, and particularly policymaking in devolution, reflect this? And all of this is also underscored by the experience of the current pandemic, not just in the case study with the mutual aid group that I pointed you to just a minute ago, but also in a pandemic that has demonstrated that the centralist tendency in policymaking in this country has repeatedly and demonstrably come up short when organising test and trace, for example, or when trying to make use of the enormous tens of thousands strong NHS volunteer army that was organised on the Good Sam app. When I was speaking to someone for my research a few weeks ago, I was told that in their jurisdiction, thousands of people had signed up to participate in this volunteer system on the Good Sam app, and only 30 tasks had been assigned to people over the course of the first 2 months of the pandemic. The localized and decentralized responses in other parts of the world have done a better job in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And this is an agenda that is also highlighted by the breakdown of trust in institutions. For example, the decline of trust in political institutions. Recently, trust levels have shored up, of course, in response to a rally around the flag effect during the pandemic. But we can see this playing out in other places, non-political or less political places too. The decline of trust in police forces, the fraught, shall we say, relationship between police forces and the public in the USA. That's all, at least arguably, tied to the consolidation program that led several independent police forces to be combined together into more distant institutions not so very long ago in the US's history. In this country, in the UK, we still hear regular calls for police departments to be combined in the name of efficiency, in the name of economies of scale, which is a strange thing to hear when it's at least arguably that same tendency has had a negative impact on trust in police in the USA. That's something that Elinor Ostrom pointed to specifically in her own research. So where is the UK policy response to all of these circumstances? Why isn't this feeding through into the arguments about further devolution? Where on earth does this Ostrom-shaped hole come from? So we're hoping to kickstart a different kind of take on how to fill that hole using our forthcoming report. So in that forthcoming report, we tried to set out 3 overlapping threads or insights from Ostrom's research that can help to inform the big debates about devolution, public service reform, and the role of communities. And the contribution here is to provide a framework, a really well-evidenced one, thanks to the labours and the efforts of Elinor Ostrom and all her colleagues over the years, to explain the nature of community activity that we see taking place in the UK, and try and identify the conditions where it works best and outperforms all the alternative models, and use that set of insights to win the big arguments that are going on at the national scale. Let me just change the slide here. So there are some overlapping insights to look at here. And we've identified 3 strands to focus on. First, of course, there's her groundbreaking work on the commons, on institutions that communities can create beyond markets and states, as Ostrom put it. And this is, of course, the work that won her the Nobel Prize in economics. Second, there are Ostrom's democratic arguments, which were heavy on localism, heavy on co-production, and on the development of a communitarian or a well-developed sense of civic responsibility as being the bedrock of real democracy. And third, there are her arguments about polycentricity and complexity. So let's take these in turn. And what I'll do is I'll just put up some extended quotes from Ostrom that I think illustrate various of these points as I work through them. First of all, that groundbreaking work on the commons, which I think in the UK context needs to be understood as well as a sort of a proof of concept for any model other than centralist norms, as well as an evidence base, if you like, for the idea that collective action problems can be solved, and are at least sometimes best solved, by highly localized systems that do not resemble either privatized individual or corporate ownership or state regulation and monopoly. Now, these systems can work because they are by definition more specifically adapted for the particularities of their context. They also create the firmer ground that you need for the incentives people require to abide reliably by the rules, to overcome individual self-interest and the incentives around that, and abide by the rules. Now, those reasons for abiding by rules are complex and multifarious, but here are some basic ones. People need to think that the local rules are good. To think that they're good, they need to think that they're locally appropriate, that they've been made with the local area in mind. They need to feel that they had perhaps a stake or a hand in the creation, the origination and the design of that rule system. And that'll make them more averse to the idea as well of being seen by their neighbors as rejecting those rules. It creates a strong set of incentives to abide by those rules. The conditions for self-governance of common pool resources are set out, of course, in Ostrom's very famous set of 8 design principles, but it's telling that Ostrom would also later go back and simply identify these conditions very strongly with the idea of the creation of a trusting community. That would get an awful lot of that job done. So that's Ostrom's work on the commons, the idea that you can resolve the tragedy, as it was called, of the commons, not necessarily just by state monopoly or by privatization and corporate control, but by community action, a different kind of solution beyond markets and states, as she put it. Second, there's Ostrom's status as a thoroughgoing democrat, a certain kind of democrat, but someone who invested time and effort into the notion of democracy and thought of it as a kind of a central part of making local solutions work. And I think this is perhaps the area where we're offering a bit of value to people who are already familiar with Ostrom's work in our report, simply because this is a part of Ostrom's research that's sometimes glossed over by the people who are interested in the commons, in polycentricity, in the environmental impact of and sustainability arguments of her work as well, excuse me. So from this perspective, and this is when the state is identified from the Ostromian perspective as the best institutional solution, which it will be sometimes. Ostrom would argue that in those circumstances, when the state system solution is needed, it ought at least to be democratically legitimate. And Ostrom had a very clear set of ideas about what that democratic legitimacy would look like, about how you build up legitimacy. Ostrom's perspective here is broadly communitarian in nature, and there's a relationship with the work of people like Charles Taylor. Ostrom makes a straightforward case for deep participation, and the capacity for that participation is driven up by a culture of democratic engagement, which in turn is made possible by a localized scale of action. Deep participation, as many people would remind us, is very difficult to achieve in mass publics. By localizing the scale of political action, you make that participation more plausible. This also means that Ostrom's advocacy for democracy, a localized democracy with proper civic engagement, can sidestep the kinds of arguments from ignorance that a lot of economists in particular use to attack democracy as a form of social order. I'm thinking of people like Brian Kaplan. Instead, Ostrom has a kind of a Hayekian argument here, I think, to make the existence of relevant knowledge that cannot plausibly be captured by an over-centralized system central to the argument for localism. People will have more incentives to be expert about their own circumstances, about the needs of their neighborhood, than about national policy problems. So the idea of meaningful participation, of action at a scale where your participation can plausibly make a difference, also strengthens those incentives further. Far from being ignorant inputs into a system that aggregates them and produces bad outcomes, by localizing the scale of action, you don't only build up resilience by localizing the action effect, you also create different kinds of incentive structures for people to participate in democracy in a high knowledge way. Thirdly, the third strand we're engaging on in this report is really all about Ostrom's argument about complexity, about polycentricity, about how there are no panaceas, as she put it. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions, no silver bullets. Ostrom herself did not argue that community self-governance should be the dominant model, or even the default model, really. She just said it was another viable alternative to the two polarized models that are more dominant most of the time. Community self-governance is possible. Sometimes it's more efficient. Often it could be, given the right conditions, more efficient and more democratically legitimate, as we just heard. But it's not a silver bullet, because silver bullets don't exist. You can't impose that form of order in every situation and expect it to work. The reason to embrace decentralization and local variation, among the others that I've tried to set out, is because it builds up a wider resilience, like an immune system or a holographic plate where damage to one part doesn't necessarily hurt the whole. And alongside that insulation of effect, it creates thousands of new venues for different approaches, a diversity of approaches. So people in different places being innovative in different ways, thinking creatively and coming to different conclusions from each other. This is a kind of experimentation that will let us find the approaches that work best more often. So that means that the Ostromian approach also creates a kind of discovery procedure for working models that might work very well in one place, but not in another, but they might. And that creates lots of new venues into finding solutions that improve outcomes for everyone. Good outcomes are often subjective. They're often a moving target. So experimentation seems like a good way to go about it. And sponsoring innovation also does. One size really does not fit all from the Ostromian perspective. So, to summarize, to wrap up, in this report, we're going to be making an argument for a different set of norms and principles to underpin, in particular, the devolution program in the United Kingdom, and the way the state relates to the communities that form their basis for legitimate action as their bedrock. That relationship needs to change in a fundamental way. The state needs to become more enabling, more facilitative. That's the argument we're making. And Elinor Ostrom, as this research has found and reconfirmed, and anyone who's familiar with Ostrom will already know this, of course, is the key to winning a lot of those arguments and pivoting to something more like a facilitative state or a facilitator state, rather than a totally laissez-faire one, which, while creating the space for community action, could also allow the things that corrupt and damage community action to play in as well. Or on the other hand, of course, a state that seeks to manage and control absolutely everything. Dismissing the controlling state and the facilitative state and the laissez-faire state and heading towards a more facilitative and enabling model is the ultimate and top tier, the headline policy ambition of the report. And I'll stop there, I think, because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion as well. But thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. And I just wondered whether I could, perfect, you preempted me there in unsharing the screen. Can I now ask people to think about questions they'd like to submit? If you are shy, please, there's no need to be shy. You can submit a question anonymously using the Q&A function. And what I will do is just draw your attention to a few things in the chat function, just so you're aware. First of all, one of the people, Sheldon Wilkes, asked, when will the report be available and where will it be available? Will it be on the NLGN website?
Yeah, it's all going to be online, and if anyone's interested, I'd encourage you to contact directly. I think a link has been shared in the chat to help you do that. The report is planned for publication next month, but we're still finalizing the details for the publication date.
Great, and I should add that the IEA has also started a project based on some of the work I did previously. Its working title is Welfare Beyond the State. We've got a forthcoming chapter in a book by the Archbridge Foundation, and it really touches on many of these issues. So, a different way between state failure and market failure, and how do you encourage local communities to take control and empower them to solve some of their problems in their local community rather than necessarily waiting for a government. Simon, I wonder whether I could ask you a couple of questions based on my own experience, as it were. First of all, I suppose I want to ask you about political consensus. A few years ago, we had David Cameron talking about big society. Clearly, he didn't follow through with that. But in response, what was interesting was the Labour Party at the time responded with the good society. So therefore, we seem to have a semblance of some political consensus. On top of that, when I go and speak to many of these local community groups that are tackling problems, a huge range of problems. Sometimes they are taking control of a local asset. Sometimes they're helping ex-offenders. Sometimes they're helping ex-gang members, projects like that. And I asked them about what drives them. Some of them are political. Some of them say they see themselves as local libertarians or community conservatives or cooperative socialists. But many of them say, look, we're just trying to solve a problem. And what there appears to be is political consensus there. How do we build on that political consensus to allow the space for more community action?
I mean, that's the whole ball game, isn't it? And I think the first thing to say is that there's a moment playing out right now, not only with the experience of community action during the pandemic and the demonstration of the poverty of a centralized response during the pandemic, but also predating the pandemic. During the Labour leadership election that just concluded fairly recently, we saw a lot of discussion about community power, about putting communities at the heart of the discussion. We're talking about whether left behind regions would be supported by more autonomy. We're still talking about devolution. We're still talking about take back control. And the pandemic, yes, represents a deepening of that opportunity. All the local councils we talk to, and that's a big part of what NLGN does in its everyday work, have been reporting about the new approaches, the very community-centered approaches that are emerging, the practices that they're taking on during the pandemic response. And there's an opportunity here to embed the good things, the good opportunities that have emerged from that crisis. So there's a lot of work going on in that area as well. But as you say, it's not just the Labour Party, it's not just what's happening in a few think tanks or local authorities. There's a big conversation happening in the Conservative Party, in the government, about Whitehall reform, one that could easily feed into a more grown-up conversation about devolution as well.
And as you say, there's also interest in among the libertarian movement, the classical liberal movement, rather than just writing about non-state action, actually encouraging people to do rather than write. Second question before I turn on to the Q&A, which is, when I meet a number of citizens groups or local groups, they seem to fall into two camps. One is those people who actually do something. They solve a problem. They take over a local asset. They help people who are in need. And there are another set of people who basically they're advocacy groups. They spend a lot of energy, but they don't actually try and solve the problem directly. What they do is they advocate for more state action. Now, of course, obviously I prefer the former, but is there a way of encouraging people who rather than spend a lot of energy advocating and lobbying, and quite often, sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't, to turn that energy into actually solving the problem? Or should I just accept that you'll always have advocacy and action?
I think you will have to accept that. Sorry, Said, but
Right.
there's another angle on this, and I think something that Ostrom herself might be tempted to argue is that under the right conditions, the state should be the monopoly provider of some services. That's a kind of a nuance that gets lost sometimes in the debate, but there are circumstances when it is the best social order to do things, and so some of these advocacy groups are asking for the right things and have a reasonable expectation of further investment or whatever it is they're asking for. I, like you, I think in some way prefer the idea that people take particular ownership and localize their solutions to problems. I think the outcomes from that will often be better. I think that's something we can learn more generally from Ostrom. Whether we can translate the advocates and the petitioners into activists who take on services or do things, as you put it, who get active, is a good question. Maybe more conversations like this could help that happen.
Okay, well, just before I turn to the questions, we have about 9 questions and just under half an hour. Just a couple of things I should point out. I've also, in the chat function, put a link to the IEA publication, The Future of the Commons, which discusses Ostrom's work, and you can find the link there. And also Nick Cowan, one of our regular attendees and a previous speaker here, has also put a link to a publication he wrote about Ostrom and flood management. So the viewers can find those in the chat function. So let's now turn to the questions, and I'll encourage people tuning in today to please go to the Q&A and vote on your questions. The first question is from Nick Cowan. Classical liberal political economy is often worried about the incentives of centralised grants as opposed to funds raised locally, what Buchanan labelled the Samaritan's dilemma. Was big local able to avoid some of these problems?
Yeah, I think the reality is, and I should start by saying that Local Trust is a funder on the project that I'm working on. The experience of big local has been extremely varied. And while there's tons of success stories to point to, and while some of the more difficult experiences have produced a learning process that later resulted in better outcomes too, a lot of those kinds of concerns have cropped up, of course. And yeah, so the point is that there, again, this isn't a silver bullet approach. These kinds of problems do crop up. One big local group that I spoke to for my current research pointed out that there was a huge representativeness challenge that fed into that kind of problem too. And that was something that had to be overcome very slowly and piecemeal over time. So one of the lessons here, I think, is that there's no kind of shock doctrine approach. There's no overnight fix. You can't pull the rug out and hope that there's something underneath. You need to let these institutions grow quite organically, which I think is quite a kind of classical liberal approach too.
Thank you.
Hello to Nick, who's an old compatriot of mine.
Oh, good. Right. It's good that we all come together discussing these ideas. I'm very pleased to be joined by Imogen from Danny Kruger's office, who asks, what do we mean by enabling facilitating? The state has money and convening power. So are we basically talking about shifting power by shifting money? Or does this all become more creative and exciting when we look at devolving down to local communities and out to communities, sorry, down to local authorities and then out to communities? Is the local authority rather than central government the true enabler, or can both play their part?
I think this is a really important question. It's something that we're working on in the report, really. But I think it's a both and situation. The central government's primary role is to understand that a devolution project is about fully empowering local authorities, including giving local authorities meaningful revenue raising authority and autonomy, in the name of then incentivizing those authorities, or if necessary, instructing them to feed those powers further down, if you like, to the community level. So do I think local authorities are the key partner here? Yes, that's everything that my research shows, but there's a central government policy issue here as well, which I'm sure that Danny Kruger is very familiar with.
Okay, next question from Professor Martin Ricketts, who joins us. He's also been involved in the University of Buckingham for a number of years, and as people know, the Vincent Centre at the University of Buckingham is our partner with the IEA for these academic webinars. He asks, the UK has over more than a century become over-centralised, but what is it about this centralisation that prevents the emergence of local responses? A market-orientated economist might have hoped for competition to emerge to reveal the inefficiencies of a centralised state. But Simon seems to think that this cannot happen without political reform. Is this a transactions cost argument, that without local political institutions, the transaction cost of community actions are a lot higher?
Right. So I think the argument I would make is there's some sort of a crowding out effect. I mean, the examples I just walked through a little bit, and the many other examples we use in the report and have fed into our wider work at NLGN, these all demonstrate that the emergence of alternative systems isn't contingent on further devolution of power, on a decentralization program that's worth the title, that these systems can emerge, they can scrape out their existence, they can self-sustain, just as we see market solutions self-sustain, that model prospering as well in a centralized system a lot of the time. So this isn't a necessary condition argument. Rather, this is a set of circumstances where we think it's very important that the potential benefits of community-centered approaches are recognized at both tiers of government, if you like, very local and very national, and that there's definitely a role to play, and this is an argument that Ostrom made, it's not coming from me, for the state to pivot to a more facilitative set of approaches. So it would be brilliant for the community side of things for devolution to happen and for decentralization to occur in a bigger way. Whether or not a certain set of institutions and competing approaches can emerge and a polycentric order can emerge, even if the overarching system is highly centralized. I don't think that kills the argument for more decentralization.
And as you say, there are lots of examples of crowding out. I remember a few years ago, I was working with a local Afro-Caribbean community credit union, and they were struggling, but they had a number of different ideas and a number of local savers. And what was interesting, I said, what's your biggest challenge? And they said, well, we want some engagement with local authority, but all they've done, they've started their own credit union. Whereas actually it would have worked better if that we could have worked together on this. And we just don't understand. And sometimes there are barriers at that local level. Next question.
And sorry, just to add to that, I think I should add that a lot of the time, the political imperatives and the institutional response on the part of local government comes from an incredibly high-minded, aspirational, and high-service place. If you look at the response to the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, for example, a lot of the times when mutual aid groups have been tripped up by local authorities, it's because local authorities are concerned about the welfare of residents. It's because they're worried about protecting people more than people might look to protect themselves. So, I mean, we don't like to use the term nanny state anymore, I guess. But the idea that these authorities are trying to crowd out some of these efforts usually comes from a very positive place, actually, in my experience.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago writing about the big society and talking to a number of local organisations, and they were telling me at the time that it was not only health and safety, but sometimes it was the perception of health and safety. So, for example, or child protection or other issues that were preventing them, or, for example, local groups that wanted to get together and the cost of insurance was prohibitive, and they wondered whether there was a way that they could still take action in the local community but overcome these problems. But clearly that insurance was well intentioned. Linda Webster asks, as economic activity levels increase in the UK labour force and we are able to retire later in life, how do you reconcile the availability of a volunteer group big enough to bring about the community action you discuss?
What a great question. And one of the principal findings from our work on mutual aid groups during the pandemic is that they've been driven to some extent, and in particular areas, I should add, by the emergence of this enormous working age force, by people who are on furlough, by people with a lot of skills and abilities in the private sector who are self-employed or they run their own businesses, who just found their businesses untenable during the crisis and therefore had to pivot to doing something else with their time. And the finding here is that when people have more time on their hands, when they're retired, but also when they're on furlough, for example, they don't just sit around playing video games. They will go out and support their neighbors. They will engage in reciprocal action. It's a powerful demonstration of a lot of the things that Ostrom argued about human motivation beyond narrow self-interest. Now, whether the capacity for sustaining this kind of community level effort dries up entirely after the pandemic when the furlough scheme ends, or as the if you like, the volunteer force of people who are now retired from their careers, whether the character of that population changes and shifts things too, this is a really important question. And one of the things I think we're keen to argue for, and we'll be arguing for more in the future, is more working flexibility, for less of a dividing line between working life and civic responsibility and democratic participation life, so that people can engage with their places, become invested, build up that social fabric, and really participate in their communities.
And I know I've come across a number of volunteer networks, and what they do is that they actually work with employers and encourage employers to give their staff, or their employees, a number of hours a week that they can volunteer, and they will match them with an organisation that they might be interested in volunteering, a kind of matchmaking service. So there is hope there, and I'll see if I can find some links and post them in the chat function. Next question, Kate Grigg. Really interested in your thoughts of how to adapt Ostrom's framework, often grounded in managing natural resources, to the reality of more urban environments, our cities and towns, which are already highly regulated contexts of density, diversity, and overlapping jurisdictions, in which the presence of the market is already incredibly enmeshed. How can we begin to manage these complexities and move beyond them?
So I think one Ostromian response to that would be that we shouldn't be concerned with managing those complexities, that we should engage and deepen those complexities by doing our own thing as communities in the midst of that complexity. By nesting our efforts within those polycentric orders, we might make some headway, we might not, but we'll find out. So that's the first thing to say. There is quite a lot of interesting work that's gone on about the urban commons, about commons arguments within urban contexts, and a lot of that's going to end up in the final report. So you can find some engagement with those problems too in that document when it comes out.
And what I found, just particularly being in London, there are lots and lots of these organisations, self-emerged in London, but often driven by people who are not necessarily political, but they've seen a problem in the local community. And the state has failed, the market has failed. They don't see it that way, they just see a problem. And they're motivated. And one of the issues I've been looking at is how do you encourage those who are motivated to start something? How do you help them to incubate their project, as it were? And there's a real gap in the market there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and it's something that we're all very conscious of in the kind of in the intellectual swimming pool where I swim. Weird metaphor, sorry. In the context where I do a lot of my work in NLGN and other think tanks and other community engagement organizations, this idea of mobilization, of creating toolkits, this is very central to the work we're thinking about doing next. My colleague Luca Tiratelli is working on a community mobilization report that'll be coming out very shortly that will address some of those questions too. So there is work coming on that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I should add, of course, that the IA will be doing some work on this in the future as well. So it's great that there are a number of organisations across the political spectrum. Next one, a question from anonymous attendee, so keep them coming. Does Ostrom's work have any implication for immigration policy?
Good question.
You can think about it. We can come back to it if you want.
Maybe I should think about that for a second. Yeah.
That's okay. I'm sorry, Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous. We'll come back to that. Next one. How does one govern a community-led approach without influencing choices and behaviours?
Wow, what a great question. Yes, there's a Hawthorne effect, or a kind of there's an uncertainty principle that plays out when we talk about nested institutions operating at different scales. How can the central or even the local state help to administrate and facilitate the emergence of these community-centered actions without blowing on the dice, without affecting the way that things play out, without in some way structuring the environment in which they operate? I think the realistic response, and perhaps the Ostromian response here, would be to say that you can't expect that to happen. You can't expect to have a neutral impact. The environment in which communities activate and mobilize and get things done is to some extent shaped by all sorts of variables, and one of those key variables is the behavior, the stance of the local state. And in a way, that's what this report is making the point about. So there are ways that environment, that factor in the environment provided by the state, can be made better, can be made more facilitative. Whether it could be done in a way that simply doesn't affect that level of behavior, the kinds of choices that communities make at all, I think is extremely unlikely, and maybe wouldn't even be that desirable. That's shooting from the hip with that bit, but I think it's just part of the context in which groups operate. And the whole point here is that community level operation will be more sensitive to the differences in context from place to place, including the differences in the state posture.
And there's also another angle to this, I suppose, where some of the organisations at the forefront of community action quite often are faith-based groups. And people do ask the question, and there's some discomfort. Others say, well, it's great, it's all part of the mix, about whether they are using they are there clearly to solve a problem, but inevitably some of those values of that faith-based group may come through. Does that matter? And people do ask that question. Is it proselytizing, or is it really trying to solve a problem? And that's a huge, most faith-based groups want to do good. That's it. They just want to solve a local problem. Okay, next question from Joshua Ammons. Could you say more about how Ostrom models the individual and how economists might change their view of citizens to have a more robust picture of cooperation and self-governance?
Yeah, I mean, so Ostrom's work coincided with and to some extent prefigured a lot of the modifications to the standard model and assumptions of economic work that we see playing out in behavioral economics. And so a lot of those shifts in behavioral economics marry up very neatly with the kinds of shifted assumptions that Ostrom operated with as well. To be clearer than I think I was in the presentation, Ostrom continues to assume a degree of, or at least a dominant degree of rational self-interest on the part of agents, on the part of people. What she argues is that there are more countervailing influences on what that self-interest could look like in different circumstances than most classical economists would take into account. The importance of community esteem, the importance of perception among one's peers, the if you like, a version of gambler's vanity, the buy-in effect of having had a stake and a voice in the creation of rules as opposed to having them imposed on you. All of these change self-interest rather than making self-interest irrelevant. So those are the kinds of things you might want to integrate. And as I say, I think behavioral economics is doing quite a good job of incorporating those kinds of issues.
Yeah, and also it challenges the view of the sort of, the classical economics of the individual being this rational individual, purely acting in self-interest. But forgetting self-interest is not selfishness. Self-interest, you do care about your community around you.
Exactly.
You do care about your family. You care about others.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mark Benier, he says, I like the ideas. My fear over trying to develop this is that to successfully change mindsets in the UK, we need to be teaching a different form of citizenship to our children from a young age. Should we not also be teaching children that collaborative local problem solving is the way to solve problems, as opposed to the two-sided confrontational approach of our politicians? Can local action alone drive this fundamental change in mentality?
Yeah, great idea. Who was that? Mark Benier?
Mark Benier.
Email me, Mark. Great idea. I think that's absolutely right, because what Ostrom wrote about an awful lot was the Tocquevillian concept of a science and art of association. Now, I personally, and I think Ostrom to some extent, preferred an experiential model, wherein people essentially learn the ropes by pulling on them. By participating in these systems in mature democratic engagement, you become better at engaging in mature democratic engagement. And you can't educate your way out through a citizenship project of some of these challenges. But I do think the standard of citizenship could be higher. I do think civic engagement should be more central to our lives and indeed our educational lives. And it could play an important role in improving the way that people participate in their local areas. But I do think that the key thing is to shift the incentives, and to shift the incentives, you bring decisions closer to home.
I would add, Mark, that I say this as a former politician, I would not say that, whereas, first of all, there is political consensus, and we saw some emerging consensus during the big society, good society debate. But the other side of that was that they were competing with each other to offer local solutions. And one of the things that I've always thought would be interesting is, what if local political parties at branch level started really engaging with their community and solving some of the problems? And you saw competition between local political parties at the local level. Surely that would drive more community action. But anyway, that's just a thought.
Just as an aside, I think that's exactly how the Liberal Democrats operated for about 15, 20 years there. I don't know, I'm not that attached to the Lib Dems anymore, but I think that was sort of the hallmark of their activity, was they would just create a kind of a galvanizing force in a local community, and the effects at the electoral scale were really notable.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be great, for example, if the local community, conservative group, for example, opened up their building and offered after-school clubs, for example, and then the Labour Party saw that and said, oh, we're going to do that too, and competing with each other to offer local services. Of course, you have to be very, very careful about the political side to it, but there's that competition could drive local action. This brings us on to the next question from Casey Morrison. What's the role of local councils in this, given they've been systematically defunded over the last decade, but also they haven't really tried the double devolution model in the new Labour years?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. So there's an interesting relationship to explore between the defunding of councils, which happened to an enormous scale during the austerity years, if you can put it that way, of the coalition government, and immediately afterwards. Something like halving the amount of spending power that most councils had, I believe. So the extent to which the austerity project really did primarily fall on councils' shoulders, I'd argue. And that had a huge impact on their capacity to deliver services and to maintain standards in their services. This had a paradoxical impact on the community power movement, as we call it, because it led a lot of councils to start experimenting, building partnerships, and talking to local communities. What I think would be optimal is if the services that the council must provide are properly funded all the way down the line, and indeed that councils are given revenue-raising powers in order to help them do that. But also that councils are properly funded to facilitate and support community-level solutions to problems as well. It's not an either-or. But yeah, I'm speaking as a member of NLGN, the new local government network, and I think that local councils are going to be the prime vector for such an approach, and that they need to be properly empowered and funded to get it done.
Just wonder whether I can ask you something on using the word defunded, if you like. There's a movement in the US to defund the police. And that doesn't mean what some people think it means, is to eliminate the police. What they're saying is, a lot of money's gone to our frontline police services, but maybe we could actually be funding instead community services, which would be more preventative, as opposed to waiting for a crime to be committed. I know I'm simplifying it, much. Is there hope in that defund the police model, or is it really an anti-police sort of a campaign? Is there hope in that defund the police model that we might see some more community action to tackle problems before they become crimes?
Yeah, I really do think there could be. And in the context of the UK, I think it's especially important from an Ostromian perspective to avoid the calls to resist the calls to consolidate police forces. In the US context, I think we're already in Minneapolis, for example, there are some signs that there is political movement now towards a more community-centered approach, which could well build up higher levels of trust and a more universally beneficial approach to law enforcement, if I can put it that way, than is currently the norm.
And there's some amazing projects out there. I mean, if you think about projects like Clean Sheet or Bounce Back that stop people coming out of prison and reoffending, or projects like Regenerate on the Roehampton estate, which turn former gang members and drug dealers into sandwich dealers, as it were. What it stops them doing is recommitting crime, and it actually has a massive input into the criminal justice system rather than just rearresting perpetual offenders, as it were. Okay, we've got a few minutes left, and a few questions. Some of them may not all be relevant, but I'll just throw them at you and see what happens.
Okay.
What fiscal contractionary policy is the government likely to pursue amid the coronavirus?
What fiscal policy is the government likely to pursue now?
Yes.
I think there are definite warning signs in play right now that the government's going to continue to underfund the local response to the COVID pandemic.
Right.
Which is a problem, and we're campaigning quite hard to see that doesn't play out.
What monetary policy is the Bank of England likely to pursue? Is that a question that you were able to answer?
Well, it'll be avoiding inflation, but that's all I can. Right?
Yep, it's fine. Don't worry. We had a seminar yesterday, and what was great about the speaker, we said, look, some of those questions I haven't done research into this. It's not my area, so
right.
We accept that. Okay. I think someone was. I think this question relates to when I was talking about the difference between groups that are advocacy groups and groups that are actually do something, if that makes sense. I think it's a criticism of the comment, but I want to be fair to the person who asked this question. He said, is that argument valid? Even when a provider is central, local advocacy groups might improve the information needed to provide the service.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I think that there's definitely a role to play there. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so there we are. I apologise to anonymous attendee if I offended you by my preferring action over advocacy, but at least you got to answer your question. The next one I should just read to you is a criticism, and I suppose give a chance to, I'm sure you didn't mean this at all. It says, when you say run by high-minded people, I think you need to be careful about how you speak. Right. When Mr. Kamal was stating that he worked in an Afro-Caribbean community, you stated that the council and community is run by high-minded people. Are you saying Afro-Caribbeans aren't high-minded?
Oh my God, no.
I'm sure you weren't. Yeah. So just thought I would answer that. It wasn't intended. And then the final, I think that's it. Actually, that brings us remarkably. You've answered if this was Mastermind, you would have answered 12 or 13 questions ready for the next round. Thank you very much for joining us, Simon, today. Can I also thank all our viewers and listeners for joining us, and thank you for the questions. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll agree that was a very interesting talk from Simon, and it encouraged us to think about how we can encourage community action when there appears to be both market failure and state failure. For more details of our content online, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, IEA London, or listen to our podcasts on Podbean. And finally, please visit our website, iea.org.uk. And to help us keep providing free content during these tough times, please do consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, where you can donate online at iea.org.uk. Thank you.